the good questions for a minute. We'll see.
So Sam McKee from Manchester Met, take it away.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. And thank you for putting on this conference here at the University of Liverpool. I want to share with you guys about one of the more surprising turns in the history and philosophy of science, something that probably wasn't supposed to happen and certainly wasn't expected. But lo and behold, this unexpected turn came around. To many who are unfamiliar, the new physics boom of Einstein's generation is perhaps the greatest revolution in the history of science. If you take that 10-year period between the proof of general relativity in 1919 and the trend through Big Bang cosmology and then the birth of the new quantum physics, is maybe the most disruptive, overturning, explosive period in the history of science. And it overthrew everything, but it also overthrew a lot of philosophy. It created huge waves through philosophy. And it potentially could have proved and cemented the dominance of scientific materialism over all its competitors. But the reality is actually quite different in ways that we might not have expected. Idealism, the idea that mind is preeminent over matter, actually ended up featuring heavily in the interpretation of the new physics. And I'm just going to call it the new physics from now on. By the way, I am a scientist myself. A lot of what I'm saying is not easy for me to say, but hey, who wants to do it easy? This is philosophy, right? But this came from the physicists themselves. So what I'm talking about here with interwar physics, I'm talking about Einstein's generation, predominantly between the end of World War I, the beginning of World War II. I want to start with one of our favorites, David Hume. If we go back and look at what is he attempting to overthrow, what is it that we're contending with? For those who are not familiar, David Hume, of course you're familiar with David Hume. I don't even need to explain who he is. But the legend, and I emphasize legend here, is that Hume, when he's doing his inquiry concerning human understanding, gave this quote: if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. And the legend is that apparently he picked up a Bible and threw it into an open fireplace. It's legend, it probably didn't happen, but I like to imagine that maybe it did. And so that's what we've got. The growing sentiment that mathematical and scientific knowledge was perhaps sufficient, and you don't need to do anything else. You don't need to do any armchair speculation or thought experiments. As a scientist myself, I do see a superior quality in epistemology to science just because it's repeatable. Anyone can do it anywhere. But is it enough in itself? Materialism and naturalism, I'll use those interchangeably at times because I like being complicated. Einstein changed everything. Just a quick history note here. When asking the question, how do we discover truth about the world? Einstein didn't just change science, he changed philosophy. In 1929, Martin Heidegger gave a lecture in Freiburg on the topic of nothing. And one of the worst quotes in the history of philosophy, I think, comes from that, where he says, the nothing itself, nothings. And that was a point where I think a lot of people in philosophy in Europe at the time went, what are we doing here? Einstein has just proven something with such exactitude and precision. It's got a quality to it in terms of knowledge that we want. That used to be us. Us philosophers used to have that. We used to rule that roost. And here's this clown over here saying that nothing itself, actually nothing's. Incredible. So Rudolf Carnap, a philosopher of science in 1931, charged Heidegger with serious offense to the discipline of philosophy. And he, among with many others who became the Vienna Circle, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, who birthed logical positivism, said, you know that Einstein guy over there, we need to be a bit more like that. If we're going to take ourselves seriously, philosophy needs to move that way. Philosophy needs the precision of Einstein and his exactitude. In 1919, Sir Arthur Eddington, a British physicist who's the central figure of my own PhD, proposed that he could prove Einstein was right and Newton was wrong by sailing to Principe Island off the coast of Africa and taking a photo of the solar eclipse. And if Einstein was right, the starlight would not be where it's supposed to be in photo, it would be off, because the sun's gravity would warp space-time and the stars that should be there would be there. And he made a mathematical prediction and bam, nailed it. It's incredible. The next day, Einstein was world famous and physicists became rock stars for the first time. And there's something of that precision that philosophers felt they had lost and wanted to regain. So how can we discover truth about the world? The impressiveness of the falsification criteria of Einstein's proposal really hit people hard. And Karl Popper, one of my favorite philosophers, is really the best articulator of falsification. The idea that it was experimental, that you could repeat it, was valuable. But what place does verification have? Just gathering evidence for my claims anymore. Logical positivism saw Einstein's move as key to a better epistemology. This is somewhat of a move back to Hume. So I'm just going to highlight some of the key dates that I'm concerned with. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through it for long. We've got Eddington's proof of relativity, which I mentioned in 1919. Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian priest, arrives at Cambridge in 1924 and starts working under Eddington, charged with applying Einstein's maths to the cosmos. Schrödinger's wave mechanics come about in 1925. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in 1927. Both of them won Nobel Prizes for it. Lemaitre's singularity paper is published in 1927, and Eddington arranges it for it to be translated into English. And the Big Bang cosmology is born. We're about to celebrate 100 years of that. Paul Dirac, who also wins the Nobel Prize, formulates his Dirac equations in 1927. The fifth Solvay conference on the new quantum physics happens in 1927. And Eddington publishes The Expanding Universe, the first English language book on the Big Bang, in 1931. And science and all our understanding of the world and what's true about it flips. Everything that was once ordered, simple to understand, had its place, made sense. No one seems to know what the new world is anymore. And philosophers enter into the fray of what this means. I'm going to show you a couple that you wouldn't have heard of. If they were any other era, they would be far more famous than they are. I want to start with Sir James Jeans. Sir James Jeans is probably the greatest scientist you've never heard of. Phenomenal individual, a real polymath, a magnificent mathematical mind with what he could do. He was at Cambridge, he won the mathematical tripos, was the second wrangler, was appointed a fellow of Trinity College at the age of 24. Can you imagine being made a fellow of a college before you finished your PhD? Those were the days, huh? He's then made a fellow of the Royal Society before he's 30. He becomes professor at Princeton before he's 30, one can dream. He was a part of Mount Wilson's observatory in Caltech for the rest of his life. He was at the first Solvay conference in 1911 and the second in 1913. He gave the Christmas lectures. He was knighted. He's a giant in astrophysics and philosophy of science. So why haven't you heard of him? Oh, he was a very prolific interpreter of what the new physics was. This is, if you don't know what the Solvay conference was, the 1911 Solvay conference was a global conference of prominent physicists trying to solve the biggest problems in physics. And this was the first ever one, and it was held biennially except for the war years after that. Here you've got Marie Curie, you've got Einstein, you've got de Broglie, you have Ernest Rutherford, you have so many figures here. And James Jeans is right here. And then he was at the second one as well. Now, Jeans was a great interpreter of the new physics to people who had no flipping clue what on earth was going on. What does this mean? I understand that it's amazing and it's massive, but what the heck is going on? I don't understand at all. Jeans, probably his best gift actually was just in translating all this stuff for the common folk. And but the surprising turn on this people find is that rather than everything being more able to be explained by physical material processes, actually, Jeans seems to be suggesting that mind is now very, very important. It seems this Einstein guy is suggesting that the observer is more important than they used to be. Your perspective seems to matter a lot. What you're looking at and when you're looking at it seems to have some sort of effect on reality. That can't be right. This is mad. In his first book in 1930, The Mysterious Universe, that sold 100,000 copies in 1930, comparable to the top-selling science communication books you could get from Waterstones today. He says, the stream of knowledge is heading towards a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter. Mind keeps showing up, mind with a capital M. He wrote a series of books, each of which sold in tremendous numbers, following on as these breakthroughs were being known to the public. The Mysterious Universe, The New Background of Science. And in 1943, he published Physics and Philosophy, really breaking it down. But he is far from alone. I want to look at his rival, Eddington, who was the man who in 1919 proved that Einstein was right and Newton was wrong. This is seriously outrageous. Eddington holds Isaac Newton's chair during the First World War. And he is saying this German physicist is right, and Newton, who is God in Cambridge, is wrong. Seriously disruptive. Einstein and Eddington start writing to each other through De Sitter in the Netherlands during the war. If they're caught, that's really, really bad. But he persuades Cambridge University, either we will have proven Newton, our English giant, is supreme over all others, or we will have proven the new theory of gravity. And he gets permission to do it in 1919, and it's an extraordinary day. He's just had his own suburb built in Cambridge, near the Institute of Astronomy, named after him. Eddington has now been immortalized with his own Sainsbury's and some student accommodation. He would be so proud. Anyway, when he reveals this, he stands under a floor-to-ceiling size painting of Isaac Newton, and he begins his unveiling by saying, "Forgive us, Sir Isaac, for you are undone." Our science used to be really, really dramatic. Anyway, I nerd out about this stuff. Eddington was a Quaker, had a very different take on the nature of ultimate reality. Quakers, if you don't know, they're into mysticism. They have sort of a different approach to this. And he wrote, he gave Gifford lectures in 1927. They were transcribed into a book, The Nature of the Physical World, also sold 90,000 copies in 1927. He said, to put the conclusion crudely, the stuff of the world is mind stuff. As is often the way with crude statements, I shall have to explain that by mind, I do not here exactly mean mind, and by stuff, I do not at all mean stuff. Physics is always clear, which is very, very helpful. But mind stuff is actually fundamental to reality. What if, rather than matter being the fundamental basis of ultimate reality, consciousness is instead? What if consciousness is the real fabric of the universe, and on top of that, you sprinkle matter? An outrageous thing for a physicist to say at the time. But he released a series of books as well. Many of them were lectures that were transcribed. I mentioned The Expanding Universe. It all built up to his ultimate philosophy, which was published in 1939. It took a lot of refining. Unfortunately, it was published a few months before the Second World War, which is why he's not a bigger name in philosophy of science, although both these gentlemen are big names in the birth of philosophy of science as its own discipline. But the argument here that mind is fundamental, he said the new physics has cleared the rubble to help us see a bit more clearly. Eddington's got this great quote about the place of science and the search for truth. He says it's like climbing a mountain, and what you're doing is you're getting closer and closer and closer to purer truth as you climb. You're never quite reaching ultimate truth, but it's a purifying process as it goes on. Now, in 1929, he really pissed off Bertrand Russell and a number of other people. Now, Bertrand Russell, not the sweetest guy in the world anyway. It's not very difficult to piss him off, but he really, really pissed off Bertrand Russell with this. He says, materialism in its literal sense is long since dead. Later on in the book, he says, materialism is dead, dead, dead. This is an award-winning physicist we're talking about here. And I'm not going to read all that because you've done plenty of reading of screens here. But he makes the case here, again, that the universe is fundamentally made of mind stuff. The outrageous part towards the end that really got Russell, who's a vicious atheist at the time, was he said that ultimately the nature of ultimate reality is spiritual. And that, obviously really ticked him off. Also ticked off Susan Stebbing and a number of other physicists at the time. You've got this award-winning physicist here to tell us what the new physics means, and they stand there and say, mind is more important than matter. What is going on? How does this happen? He wasn't the only one. There are a couple. I'll just highlight Edward Arthur Milne, again, would be much more famous in any other era. When he gets into the popular writing game, he writes this first book, Modern Cosmology and the Christian Idea of God, in 1950, republished in 1952. Right, let's kick on. What about these guys, the Nobel Prize winners? How many of you are familiar with Owen Schrödinger and Schrödinger's cat? Just give me a nod if you're familiar with Schrödinger's cat. Yeah. The idea you have a cat. I'm a cat lover. I have 2 cats myself. I don't like thinking of it, but you have a cat in a shoebox and a vial of poison gas. And you open the box, the gas is going to be released, the cat is dead. But until then, you don't know if the cat is alive or dead. It's simultaneously both alive and dead. How can that happen? And then parallels the nature of the electron. Werner Heisenberg, familiar with him? Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can know where an electron is or how fast it's moving, but you cannot know both. The act of observation is what locks in the truth, the nature of the electron. How can this be going on? Well, Schrödinger had great sympathy with Eddington's ideas. You're probably not surprised, actually, that Schrödinger quite likes the mystical, more mind-based ideas, given what he writes about the cat. I hope he never experimented on his cat, by the way. Likewise, Heisenberg's uncertainty underpinned a lot of this move towards idealism. Heisenberg, also a religious man, so it sort of fit in quite well with his general worldview anyway. But when we account for it, all of the rules seem to change. It's like we have one brain operating in relativity and another brain operating when we deal with quantum mechanics, and the two cannot be reconciled. All of these guys tried to find a theory of everything and failed. All of them. For Eddington, it ruined his career and ruined his legacy because he tried to count the mind in his theory of everything, and people called it numerology, and it kind of buried his legacy for a generation. The next generation of physicists, Richard Feynman's generation, have no interest in philosophy. They don't write about it. They're warded off. Instead of dealing with trying to find a theory of everything, none of them attempted it. Instead, they were interested in drilling into the practicalities, Feynman diagrams, Feynman equations, discovering the remaining subatomic particles. Basically, a generation is lost in terms of physics and philosophy. Doesn't really engage with it as much. Just a few important notes here. The interwar physics generation largely didn't subscribe to logical positivism. You know, you've got the philosophers saying, let's be more like physics, and the physicists try and write philosophy and they just get trashed for it by the philosophers and go, well, never mind then. And you kind of have this split when it was supposed to be a coming together, but they really didn't subscribe to it. A gulf began to arise between the philosophers and scientific understanding. The gulf was occupied by philosophically minded physicists like Eddington and Jeans, but they just got trashed for it by a lot of the philosophers. It's like the philosophers were saying, you're not real philosophers, you don't know what you're doing. And the physicists will go, well, you guys don't understand the science. So, okay, we'll stay over here, you stay over there, we'll just do that. Many of the philosophers of the era rejected these works, as I mentioned. Physics took a lean towards idealism during this period, and many of them tried to find an ultimate theory of reality off the back of it. But after their failure, the next generation was too philosophical. The other thing that happened, of course, was after the atomic bomb was dropped, many physicists jumped ship. They went to biology, and they gave birth to the molecular biology revolution. Gamow and a whole bunch of others, Francis Crick, for which we're all reaping the benefits today. I was speaking to a professor of physics at Oxford, Peter Atkins, who's a friend of mine, and he suggested part of this problem may be that our brains evolved to find snakes and tigers, not theories of everything. You know, 200,000 years ago, when our ape-like ancestors, and Homo sapiens stopped moving through the world out of Africa, we had brains that were really, really built for survival in a tough world. Maybe our brains just are never going to be able to really peel back what ultimate reality is. And philosophy cannot always follow where science goes. Maybe we need to live with a logic that is both and. We operate, as Eddington says, with one brain for relativity, and it works for big stuff, and one brain for quantum physics, and it works for small stuff, and never the two shall meet. Maybe that's how it will be. And I just want to finish with this provocation, for lack of a better word. Is idealism back? This is Sir Roger Penrose. After Eddington died, a memorial lectureship was set up in his honor every year at Cambridge, and they were published every year by Cambridge University Press into the mid-70s. And it's a who's who of Nobel Prize winners and incredible philosophers. It was a synthesis of science, philosophy, and religion. So you had someone from each discipline each year speaking. John Hick gave one from philosophy of religion. Michael Polanyi, the polymath philosopher and chemist, gave one. And Roger Penrose gave one in the 90s called The Emperor's New Mind. And it ended up becoming published as a book in his own right, and something he was known for. Give me a nod if you've heard of panpsychism. Yeah, you all have. Panpsychism is back in fashion in a way that I would not have expected. I was listening to a debate on panpsychism 5 years ago, and the guy defending panpsychism credited Arthur Eddington as being the modern father of it. So the physicists are responsible for this idea that maybe the nature of ultimate reality is consciousness. Maybe after all the physics that we've gone through in the next generation and Hawking's generation, and now dealing with peeling back the layers of the universe with the James Webb Telescope, and the Eddington Memorial Lectureship goes on to this day, purely with an astronomy focus. Maybe after all of that, we look back 100 years and say, maybe Einstein's generation was right after all, and we shouldn't have knocked them not for being philosophers. Maybe. I'm not going to answer that now. I'm just going to poke you with that stick and leave you with that. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sam. Does anyone have any questions or feedback for our speaker? Yes.
Thank you for the talk. It's just me trying to defend logical positivism on every occasion. So you had this quote from Arthur Eddington about how it appeared to him that all of science seems to be a bunch of mathematical equations, and I think logical positivists, especially 𝐂onnect, like later 𝐂onnect, would probably feel inclined to agree with that, because he later on starts to give this kind of reconstruction of scientific theories, where it basically said, okay, those terms in the we can represent those theoretical terms in physics by just numbers, and then we just have a bunch of equations describing the structure rather than like reality in a kind of like metaphysical sense. And I'm just thinking there seems to be a difference between saying, okay, all of science is just mathematics, and to say that the world is made of mind stuff. Because there are people suggesting, for instance, that mathematical entities, of course they are abstract, but they will also suggest mathematical entities at the same time are still like mind independent. So I'm just wondering.
I'm not against the logical positivists, and I do like 𝐂onnect. And it's not easy for me to think, because I'm in a lab half the week. That ultimately what I'm doing here is not the nature of physical reality. I work in cancer research, so I better hope that it does deal with ultimate reality. But when you think hard about it, if it all boils down layer upon layer, Eddington used to joke about how the physicists don't really like the pure mathematicians, because the pure mathematicians go, you think what you're doing is real. You're nothing without us. And go down and down the layers of what you decide, what level am I going to explain reality. Eddington famously talked about a physicist and an ordinary person are trying to cross a bridge. The ordinary person looks at the wooden bridge and goes, well, great, cool, a bridge, and walks across. The physicist looks at the bridge and knows ultimately it's composed of mostly empty space, and then within that empty space are atoms and subatomic particles moving at furious speeds that aren't always interacting in a way that you expect, and that the bridge is mostly composed of probabilities, and the physicist can't cross because he's terrified. So what do you do? What world do you live in? I think the logical positivists succeeded at the popular level, at least, even though it's hard to find them today. And yeah, there's not a good enough. I still don't think this is a problem we've solved. But thank you for your question.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I'm very interested in like maybe I've already heard of like explanations of like the uncertainty principle and never say his name. Schrödinger's cat, and probably physicists like describing it, maybe reacting to like idealistic interpretations. So I just want to maybe hear your thoughts on that reaction. So I heard that it's described as an observer was like a bad name for it, and it's really just any kind of macro interaction with the quantum state collapses it, the probabilities and stuff. And it's not like mind. That's like you can just do it with cameras and any kind of instrument. Not it doesn't actually need a mind. I've heard that. I think the same with relativism, right? You like watch a clock be aged, and the relativism there might not be mind dependence. So what?
Yeah, there's a lot there, and some of it is relativity, and some of it is quantum physics. There's no doubt that the new physics works better than anything we know. Quantum physics is more exact than anything we could ever imagine. It works. It is true. It just takes you to some really, really strange places where the laws of logic, normal reality don't work. And the same with relativity. One of the first things Eddington did was apply Einstein's maths to the problem of the orbit of Mercury, which had always been off, according to Newton, and solved it exactly. And the story goes that Einstein was dancing in his living room when he got the letter saying that had happened. So it works. What relativity takes you to is ultimately all we're describing is relations, ultimately, within a reference frame. And so what I'm describing happening here may not be perfectly true over there, but it describes it better and more accurately than anything else. And quantum physics takes you to some even stranger places, I think. You think this can't possibly be true. How can an electron be there and not there at the same time? How can it be moving and stationary at the same time? It doesn't seem to work, and yet it works better than anything. And so when you say, okay, this works better than everything, but it breaks all the rules of everything we thought. Remember, the world was ordered. It was a machine. Everything was a machine with Newton. Now it's not a machine anymore. James Jeans says the universe is not designed by an engineer. If there's a God, he's not an engineer. The universe is not a massive mechanical clock anymore. It's pure maths. Everything boils down to that. And what's the basis for pure maths? Well, people landed on mind. And maybe mind is fundamental to everything. It seems to be when I observe something, it has an effect. And when I observe something, it's true, but I'm observing relations. It's true here, it may not be true over there. So maybe they didn't get it right, but it overthrew what was before, proved itself more true, and took you to some tricky places. And maybe that's why the next generation just didn't bother asking questions about it. Thank you. Sorry, I know I'm going too long.
No, I think we've got time for one more question. Do you have a question?
Thank you. I have one struck. So this was a very good explanation of how modern physics evolved and the disjoint between philosophy. But what's the argument? I didn't understand. Like, what's the problem? And
The argument.
do you think that there's a reason why we had this disjoint throughout the history? Or,
The argument between philosophy and physics, or the argument that I'm making?
Yes, the presentation.
Okay, the presentation is just when you get the biggest revolution and boom in the history of science, and we understand the nature of ultimate reality better than we ever did. Instead of taking us more to a place where science can explain everything and materialism is the basis of reality, instead it throws us back to the idealism that preceded much of the modern scientific revolution and said, actually, science seems to suggest that mind is more fundamental, more foundational than matter. And that was not expected. That was a turn in the history of science that wasn't supposed to happen. If you talk to, and I love them to death, people like Richard Dawkins will say that, we had superstition and we had philosophy or Comte, you know, the different eras people would go through. And then science came along and bam, we got rid of all of that, you know, and science became fundamental. Well, this, it doesn't work when you get to Einstein's generation. Actually, the biggest boom in the history of science threw people back onto mind. A lot of them, they seem to be mind. Not a single one of them agreed with the logical positivists, which is shocking. Sorry if that wasn't clear enough.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more amazing conversations with incredible researchers who are changing the world we live in and working on the frontiers of driving humanity forwards. For more information, you can check out my Instagram at polymath_Sam or my website at www.sam-mckee.co.uk.